But we conclude that Israeli authorities are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Israel's total siege of the Gaza Strip has weaponized the provision of life-sustaining necessities for strategic and political gains, including through cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. It constitutes collective punishment, disproportionately impacting pregnant women and persons with disabilities, and is causing grave harm to children, including starvation-related deaths. Palestinian women were targeted and subjected to sexual violence and harassment online and in person. Men and boys experienced specific persecutory acts, including sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture. In the 8 months since the 7th of October, tens of thousands of children, women and men have been killed and injured. Palestinians, Israelis and citizens of other states. Thousands of Palestinians have been detained and are being held incommunicado.
And I now give you the floor, Mrs. Navi Pillay, Chair of the Commission, for the presentation of the report. Dear Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, the Commission will just take a second's pause in remembrance of all the victims who lost their lives and the survivors who have suffered injuries in both Israel and Palestine. So let me greet you, Excellencies, with good morning. And to begin by saying that in the 8 months since the 7th of October, tens of thousands of children, women and men have been killed and injured. Palestinians, Israelis and citizens of other states. Thousands of Palestinians have been detained and are being held incommunicado. And 120 Israeli hostages are still being held in Gaza. The enormity of this tragedy overwhelms us, and we are deeply disturbed by the immense human suffering. We come to this Council today to present our report. The mission of this Council, as you know, is to promote and protect human rights, and that remains more important now than ever before. On the 7th October, attack in Israel and Israel's subsequent military operation in Gaza have not occurred in a vacuum. They were preceded by decades of violence and retribution, dispossession, unlawful occupation and denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination. Now, since 7th October, our Commission has carried out 2 parallel investigations. First, into attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian groups in Israel on 7th and 8th October, and second, into Israeli military operations and attacks in Gaza between 7th October and 31st December. The findings of these investigations are summarized in the report presented to you today, but they are detailed in 2 conference room papers. So as you are aware, the report we're delivering is limited by word numbers to 10,700, and this is violations of such a vast scale and ongoing that we devised this method of putting in all the details in the 2 conference papers. So I do encourage you to read this short report in conjunction with those 2 long conference papers. These reports, however, do not even begin to describe all the crimes and all the atrocities of the last 8 months, and focus on some. And so we are going to be focused on some of the most egregious events and incidents. We will be reporting on additional findings and a follow-up after 31st December to the General Assembly as mandated by you in October. International law has strict and clear regulations on the conduct of war and the conduct of self-defense, a fundamental principle of international law which underscored our findings is that unlawful action by one party to an armed conflict does not justify unlawful action by another party. Israel has a right to protect its citizens from violence by Palestinian armed groups, but in doing so, it must comply with international law. Hamas and the Palestinian armed group must also comply with international law. In relation to Israel's military operations and attacks in Gaza from 7th October, we conclude that Israeli authorities are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including extermination, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, murder, or willful killing, using starvation as a method of war, forcible transfer, gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture, and cruel or inhuman treatment. Israel's total siege of the Gaza Strip has weaponized the provision of life-sustaining necessities for strategic and political gains, including through cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. It constitutes collective punishment, disproportionately impacting pregnant women and persons with disabilities, and is causing grave harm to children, including starvation-related deaths. We found that the immense numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza and widespread destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure were the inevitable result of an intentional strategy to cause maximum damage, disregarding the legal obligations of distinction, proportionality, and adequate precautions. Israel also forcibly transferred almost the entire population into small enclosures that are unsafe and uninhabitable. The deliberate use of heavy weapons with large destructive capacity in densely populated areas constitutes an intentional and direct attack on the civilian population. Although Israeli officials have repeatedly stated that their operations in Gaza are intended to destroy Hamas and to release hostages, yet neither of these aims has been largely achieved at the expense of thousands of lives. We found that Israeli forces committed sexual and gender-based violence with the intent to humiliate and further subordinate the Palestinian community. Palestinian women were targeted and subjected to sexual violence and harassment online and in person. Men and boys experienced specific persecutory acts, including sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture and inhuman and cruel treatment. The Commission concluded that specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence constitute part of Israeli security forces' operating procedures. Excellencies, the situation in the Gaza Strip has overshadowed that in the West Bank, where Palestinian fatalities recorded since 7th October have exceeded any other recorded period. This is linked to increasingly militarized Israeli operations, a trend which we highlighted in our report to the General Assembly last year, as well as a surge in violent settler attacks on Palestinian communities, often assisted or condoned by Israeli forces.